So, in this episode of the Intentional Mom podcast, you are going to be hearing a summit presentation from my recent Simplify Your Summer online summit. We talked with Lacy Estelle, and she is an amazing mother, wife, businesswoman who has more recently come to understand and be diagnosed with ADD. And she also has some ADD kids in her household. And so she is managing this situation kind of from all sides. And she has gained so much wisdom and insight that she willingly shared with the attendees at the summit. This was one of our most popular summit presentations. And so I wanted to share it with you here on the podcast. So whether you have ADD, you live with people who have ADD, or really we really tap into some other neurodivergent situations as well. This is going to be an episode that you want to tune in for, or that you share with those who have a similar situation. So with that, let's jump into this Simplify Your Summer online summit presentation, all about managing your ADD. Well, hey there, I am Jennifer Roskamp, a certified life coach and homeschool mom of 9 who is passionate about helping women just like you embrace the here and now while also being focused on creating the life you actually want. In reality, it's not about thinking life will get so much better or so much easier when you fill in the blank. Let's work on creating a life you love now. So let's dive in and get started on redefining Supermom to be someone who is present, intentional, and content rather than perfect in our homes, in our lives, and in our own skin. Let's get started. This is the Intentional Mom Podcast. So welcome, Lacy. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before we dive into all things ADD, ADHD, can you tell us a little bit about what does life look like in your family?
Well, we are a blended family, and I have 5 kids total, like you just said. So I have one who is going to be 15 this year, all the way down to a 1-year-old who just turned 1 just recently. So, and out of those 5, 3 have a diagnosis of ADHD. And the younger ones are 4 and 12 or 12 months. And so, they don't have a diagnosis yet. If they will ever have one, I don't know. But with my older 3, it can definitely be interesting because ADHD definitely presents in everybody in different ways.
Yeah.
So they're all diagnosed. I have a diagnosis. My husband seems to think that he might have it, but he also was military background. So he has put in all of these really great rituals for himself to really cope with everything. But of course, we all drive him nuts because we're all loud, unorganized, and all over the place. So, but he loves us anyway. So yeah, it's a bit chaotic in our house, but we wouldn't have it any other way. So
Yeah.
it's good.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you about this today because I know that a lot of women, I feel like it's definitely something that's being diagnosed in adults a whole lot more. So I'm curious if you would agree with me on that. That's what I see from my perspective. So I'm curious if you see that as well. But I know that there's a lot of women who really can feel overwhelmed by this. Do you think is it something that's being diagnosed now in adults more than it used to be? And is it normal to feel overwhelmed, I would assume?
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually talk on my podcast. There's a couple episodes where I talk about, grieving the ADHD brain, because once you do get that diagnosis, a lot of times you can look back. You look back in your life and you're like, well, that's why that was so difficult for me. And I wish I had known sooner. You go through a process, like I said, of kind of grieving the brain that you always wish that you had, and then recognizing that that's really not how God made you. And that's okay. But it does take time, because you at first, usually women have this conflicting feeling, of like, yay, I got a diagnosis, but also that means that like it has been a problem that I wasn't aware of. And I have been trying to stick a Band-Aid over it for all these years and making myself feel really bad about myself for not being able to do the things I want to do. And yeah, it takes you a little time to move past that part so that you can actually start to work towards, knowing now what you're dealing with and working on getting on the other side of things. So yeah, I do notice that a lot of people are getting diagnosed more often these days. I think that's to thank TikTok. ADHD on TikTok is like a huge thing. A lot of people are talking about it on there. And I think that made it so a lot of people were like, hey, That's
Great about it.
that's not that's not a thing that everybody deals with. I thought that that was a thing that everybody struggled with. No, no,
Yeah.
not everybody struggles with the things that we struggle with. So
Yeah. Well, I know you're going to take us through like really some helpful information, but I'm curious. I would love to just ask you this question as kind of an offshoot of what you mentioned. When you were talking about how, you get a diagnosis and that helps you explain some things. You look in your past and it helps connect some dots almost. What is like the primary types of feelings that you have? Like, do you feel regret? Like, what do you when you look back on it and you're like, oh, that explains. I feel sad. Like, what do you, is there like a couple of emotions you can throw out there that somebody might be feeling when they just kind of have that time of reflection and being able to piece some things together that maybe before they couldn't make sense of?
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So I would say one of the big underlying things that especially and I see this most with ADHD women and I don't know so much about well, I guess I do know a little bit about ADHD men because I have young men in my house with it, but we feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. And I actually did it was either I did a blog post or I did a podcast something. I talked about something where the difference between shame and guilt because shame kind of keeps you stuck. And when you have ADHD, you can tend to ruminate on things. You look back over, bad decisions that you made or impulsive choices that you made, and you think to yourself, like, oh my gosh, I would have saved so much more time if I had just known that this is what I was dealing with and gotten the right treatment, whatever treatment that was for me. Sometimes you look back and you think, wow, look at me go. Like I was able to do this and this and this. Now, for me, a lot of my ADHD struggles, they came out in my relationships. My relationship with my own mother was strained. My relationship with my father was strained. And then I ended up in a toxic relationship and an abusive marriage for, a large part of my 20s. And looking at that, I had to kind of go back through the whole feeling of what I exposed my kids to and, recognizing that yeah no I definitely imperfect which we all know we're imperfect parents but at the time you're always trying to do the best you can with what you have and I remember wanting to go to school but I did not understand how all these other single moms were able to juggle a job and parenting and going to college because I could not seem to get it together. But then on top of that, my house was messy all the time. I had no real organization strategy. I had times where I just couldn't even pull myself enough to get my dishes done, which had to be done. So you go through a lot of feelings of regret, a lot of feelings like if I would have known had I known. But what I do try to help women do is think about surrendering all of that and we'll actually get to that when we as we
Yeah.
move through this interview but kind of allowing yourself to recognize that even if you had shortcomings or even if you made not the choice you would have made had you known you can still kind of let that go and watch how God will work everything out to your good so
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can you give us like a foundation just and let us know a little bit about what your journey has been with ADHD? What did that look like being diagnosed? How long? All that stuff. What is that guide for you?
Ooh, okay so I gotta
You can give us just the bare bones.
well, that's the hard part. And if any women listening to this who has ADHD and they're like, yeah, it is, it's hard. It's so hard for us to make a long story short. But between, I almost didn't graduate high school on time, which was very difficult. I had a lot of suicidal ideation around that time. I was in and out of the bad relationship. So I had all of that. I got pregnant at 18. Had my first son 3 days after I was 19. So, and when I look back in studies about ADHD in girls and ADHD in women, I was like the poster child for the undiagnosed ADHD child. They said that I was a daydreamer or that I was careless, I was lazy. I had one teacher who, pushed me because she could see that I was very good at writing and very good at communication. And so she pushed me and wanted me to do her AP class. But then she made the mistake of telling me that I couldn't make her regret doing that and to not embarrass her by not doing very well. And when you have ADHD, you need accountability, but when somebody puts that accountability on you, a lot of times you just assume you're going to fail because you've failed so much in the past. So yeah, I had all that. I had 2 children by the time I was 21. And then I got away from my ex at that time and, I sold a car. I sold the car I had at the time for like a very low amount to just get my own place. And I went to work and did all those things. And honestly, that story gets really long and really complicated, but I didn't end up getting a diagnosis until I was 28. When I started to get to a point to where I started to recognize it in myself, I started to know I had it. I was already writing about it because when my sons got diagnosed, I went, you have to fill out a paper that asks, do they do this? Do they do that? And I'm looking at that paper going, I do that. I do
So
that.
you're the classic story of you got diagnosed because your kids got diagnosed first.
Yep. And so after we got their diagnosis, I started, looking into getting my own diagnosis and what that would look like, especially because the more I learned about ADHD, the more I was like, I didn't know what a diagnosis would do for me. Because part of me was like, well, I don't know if I want medication. I don't know if I want, I had gone to therapy for years and years and years. My mom was a social worker. Of course, she came to me and she was like, I'm really sorry. I was diagnosed with ADHD in my 30s. I don't know why I didn't think that you might also have it. And so I didn't know if getting a diagnosis would really do all of that for me, but I ended up finding a really great neuropsychologist who actually goes through, he does all of the different psychological testing, which is really more of what I prefer. There is a lot of times people these days, you can just go to your primary care doctor and they'll give you a questionnaire. And if you check enough boxes, they say, yeah, you've got it. I prefer the more thorough diagnostic testing because I really needed to know, having been in and out of such a bad relationship, I was like, am I dealing with ADHD or am I just dealing with unresolved trauma?
Yeah.
That can get kind of blurry too. I think that sometimes unresolved trauma can make it worse. But once he did all the testing on me, he's like, oh, yeah, you're classic inattentive ADHD, especially because I had started to struggle with grades and schoolwork and organizing everything way back when I was like 11. And I was like, okay. And then it still took me some time. It was actually after my preschooler was born and I got married and all this other stuff. I finally went to my doctor and I was like, okay, I think I would like to try medication. I can tell you, as much as like I shied away from medication for a long time, and I actually am now, I'm on the other spectrum where I'm actually trying to get back off of it for other reasons. When you're given something and all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, you mean to tell me everybody else can just do this? Like, you just wake up and you can just function? Like, are you serious? This is what I've been missing my whole life? Like, it felt very, like I said, I had to go through a whole grieving process of like recognizing like, wow, I really have been operating with a deficit. And even though I didn't think it was a deficit, I put the blame on myself because behaviorally, that's how ADHD presents. It presents as behavior issues, not necessarily like I wasn't going out and breaking the law, but I was impulsive. People thought I was rude because I tended to interrupt people a lot. You lack this ability to have forethought before you do certain things. But then on top of it, when you go to try to focus on something that doesn't engage your interests, your brain literally shuts down. Like the activity in your prefrontal cortex that you need to be able to function shuts off. And so it doesn't matter how hard you try, you usually cannot get yourself to just snap out of it. And so you end up just telling yourself, well, maybe I am just lazy and dumb and all these things. So yeah, it was a long process, a long process.
Well, I know that you've got some steps and strategies that you're going to share with us. So let's do that because I know, and you are the expert here. So I'm just going to like toss it over to you. And I know that there is women who need to hear what you have to share. So I'm excited to toss that over to you.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it. So one of the big things that I talk about, and I think what we're going to talk about here is really embracing the struggle and learning to thrive with ADHD. So when you have ADHD, kind of like I was just talking about, you tend to put a lot of these pressures on yourself to perform the way that you see everybody else performing. And ultimately, because you have ADHD, you really can't go about things that direction. So my biggest things that I try to help women do is to embrace the fact that you are not going to have it all together, which is so funny because I think that this whole summit is kind of about that. And it's interesting to me because as an ADHD woman, especially as an ADHD mother, what I encounter so often with other ADHD moms is we seem to think that everybody else has it. Like they've got it because, they can be on time or they're organized or, they don't forget their child's doctor's appointment or things along those lines. And I've come to learn that just because our struggles are more outward doesn't mean that we're the only ones struggling.
Mhm.
So, one of the biggest things that I find that you have to do before you can ever get yourself into a practical mode of like, what can I practically do? What can I implement in my house as far as trying, be able to get over some of my symptoms or to cope better with some of my symptoms? Symptoms like, you're late all the time, you're disorganized, you can't keep your house clean. Maybe you struggle with, helping your child understand their homework because you struggle with processing. So some of their homework might seem even above your head, and that feels silly, but it's not. The first thing I try to help women do is they have to learn to let go and they have to learn to surrender. And as a Christian, this looks like surrendering everything at the feet of God. And it can be counterintuitive because we've been told our whole life we just need to try harder or we need to work harder. And instead, I tell women, I'm like, no, the first thing you have to do is recognize that it has nothing to do with you and everything to do with where God will fill in the gap. And you have to allow for him to fill in that gap. And the only way you can do that is with surrender. I've done a lot of research over, the ability of the brain to adapt and the ability of the brain has neuroplasticity. And one thing that's unique to Christians is that we recognize that, the mind and the brain are two different things. Science likes to try to tell us that the brain controls the mind, but we actually know that the mind controls the brain, just because of the fact that we are Christians, and that's what the Bible says. The Bible talks about how you have to kind of go outside of yourself and self-talk and talk to yourself about why you're upset, how big your God is, that you can cast your cares on him, that he will fight for you. You need only be still, all those types of things. And so that's where I kind of tell women, you have to find a way to let go and surrender all of the things that you're trying to control. And even if it feels counterintuitive, because obviously, we want to control things like keeping the house moving and the laundry gets done and all those things. If you can surrender something as simple as that, then you will be able to surrender something larger. After that, I also talk to them about praying for focus. Now, it seems silly because a lot of times women are like, but I can't even pray because when I try to pray, I'm thinking about all the other things that need to get done and I can't focus. And I'm like, that's why you have to pray for focus first. You pray for focus and you kind of sit in that. And that one comes with, there's a lot of other ways and techniques that you can do. And I get it more into that into like my Christian meditation vault. But in the meantime, it's a simple prayer. You can literally just say, Lord, just help me focus on this. Help me focus on whatever is the task that is set before you that you're having trouble doing. And then the last step really comes down to practicing what you're trying to implement. The hardest thing for those of us who have ADHD is the things that are easy for everybody else are very difficult for us. And so because of that, we can run out of energy really quickly. Something simple like, I'm trying to think, probably when you get undressed to get in the shower at your house, you have a habit, I would imagine, of just immediately putting the clothes in the laundry hamper. Children with ADHD don't have that habit. And so it takes a conscious effort. And I would say probably maybe any child, okay, not every child who misses the laundry basket has ADHD, but it takes a conscious effort for them to actually think, I need to pick up my clothes and put them in the laundry basket. The same thing can happen for those of us who have adult ADHD. We don't have the ingrained habits yet because it takes a lot more repetition for us to get them ingrained into our mind, to be able to do things on autopilot. If you can do things on autopilot and you don't use your energy sources to be able to do that. I get a lot of women who are like, how come, my daughter, let's say it's specifically a girl, can keep herself together at school, but she comes home and she is like a raging, mean, like feels like she's a totally different child. And I have to explain to them that she has been using all of her conscious energy to maintain the tasks that are required of her at school. So when she comes home, she is depleted. And
Yeah.
she doesn't even recognize that she's depleted, but she is. And so every little thing that you tell her, say to her, do with her, whatever, it's going to set her off and set her on a spiral of, how frustrated she is, not only with, her own the stress level that she has, but it is like kind of operating in a stressful state all the time.
Yeah.
Because the things that everybody else can just do naturally, oh, I just move through this motion, I can do this easily. We have to think of them and be thinking of them to be able to do it. And it's really hard. It's really, really hard. So it's definitely something that I try hard to teach women to doing that surrendering and then praying for focus. And I know that there's probably some ADHD woman listening to this going, oh yeah, pray for focus. Like that will help me. But it's actually the the coupling of surrendering your mind and surrendering like the brain that you were given, because God knows He gave you that brain. Something happens between the surrendering and then the praying for what you're asking for. And I couldn't tell you what it is, but I can tell you that it works because I've seen it work for some women that have done my mentorship. And then I've also seen it work in my own life. And I tried applying similar principles to my son, he's pretty severe ADHD, but he's pretty close of that borderline of like autism. He struggles with dyslexia and a few other things. And we did some visualization stuff with him before his last wrestling meet. He had not won a wrestling match the entire season. And we did some of that. We prayed, and he won his first match, like right away. So I know that as much as like a lot of times I'll hear women say, I've had ADHD my whole life. I can't force myself to do this or to do that. It's kind of like I told my oldest son, you have to find a way to change your perspective about what it is that you're dealing with. Surrender the fact that you don't like it or you don't want to do it or it's very difficult for you. And then you have to kind of force yourself to go through the motions until your brain can go, okay, this isn't that bad. This isn't that difficult.
Yeah.
It is hard. And it's
Yeah.
much harder for those of us with ADHD, but it gets easier with practice.
This brings back a conversation that I had because my son, I have one son who's diagnosed with ADHD. My dad has it, my sister both diagnosed. My husband has it diagnosed. He was diagnosed in his mid-20s. Similar to you. We didn't have kids though, but I'm like, I think I'm learning about ADD. I'm learning about because it was really the time that my dad started to learn about adult ADD because we were used to the kid who had ADD. That was my 8-year-old sister.
Mhm.
But so as I was learning about my dad, I'm like, I think this is my husband. So he took one of those like evaluation tools and I took it on his behalf first. And I scored it a 24 out of 25. You have this. So then I said, take this thing. If it's interesting. So he took it, same thing, 24 out of 29. But so I have my one son who's diagnosed. I have two other kids who I know have it. One of them I was able to just kind of she's very receptive to behavioral management and just we were able to because by that time I knew so much about it and I had so many tools for helping the other people in my life with it. I could just kind of help her build these tools and that was good for her. But all that to say, my one son who is now 21, he's the one who's diagnosed. I go to all of his ADD appointments with him with his ADD doctor. And he was describing to me that this is a whole new thing. I'll just warn you of this when you start getting kids who drive. When he learned how to drive, he was just a bad, bad driver. And we had to talk about like he would just like there was some scary things, and we would talk about it with his doctor because I'm like, I don't know, this is scary. And I say nothing against him, right? But he was explaining to me, it's because your brain, the non-ADD brain, can make all of these connections about driving, essentially cause and effect. One is driving, but it's pretty much 100% cause and effect.
Mhm.
And so he was describing and explaining your son does not have these, just like you were saying, your son does not have these cause and effect understandings in his brain like you do. He has to build all of those.
Mhm.
And so as a driver, he has to learn, like you take for like he says, I'm not saying anything's bad about you, but he's like, you take so many things for granted because your brain just does it for you. And so he was explaining essentially he has to be a really bad driver so that he can learn how to start building these things. And that was about a year and a half ago. And he's an amazing driver now. In fact, I don't know. I have many teen drivers. I would say he's a good driver. But it brings me back hearing you talk about that. That's the way that his doctor described it too, as and so then if you think about it, because you're constantly building these pathways, but of course you're going to be exhausted all the time.
Yep, you are. And it's funny that you bring up driving because I just told my husband, I said, I think I'm finally getting on the other side of like, because chauffeuring my kids around as a blended family, we have 3 kids in public school. I have 1 kid who is in preschool, who me and my his father, we still haven't sorted out where he's going. And then I have my youngest who we know we're going to homeschool. I spend so much time driving. And then my one son also does vision therapy for his dyslexia and also for his ADD and everything else. So I'm driving to that appointment and to this appointment. And there was days where I told my husband, I'm like, I can't do it. I'm done. I can't cook dinner tonight. You're going to have to figure something else out because the driving was just draining. But it's like you said, it's because I was having to use my conscious mind a lot for a while of, I was having to not only, try to organize the thoughts of like my children who are in the car who want to talk to me and ask me questions and things along those lines. And also, where do I have to turn next? What are the other cars on the road doing? And I'm getting to a point now, and I think because I've had to drive so much in the last few years, that driving can be less stressful for me. But there was a lot of days where it was like, if I had to drive more than 2 or 3 places, when I got home, I was like, nope, I'm done. I'm checked out. And it does take that practice, and it sucks because a lot of times when you're as an ADHD kid or even as an ADHD adult and you're going through that, like, I have to kind of fail at this until I'll figure it out, everybody else loses patience with you because everybody else is like, why can't you just do it? And you're like,
Everybody knows that.
it takes me so much longer to do the repetition of, and also it takes my reward system is wonky, basically. I mean, that's kind of what ADHD talks about. It talks about your processing speed is usually a little bit slower. So as far as like sequencing things, like there was a tweet back when it was still Twitter, right? But there was a tweet from a woman who was like a therapist, and she said, one of the easiest ways I have of explaining how the ADHD brain is to other people is what I think of a peanut butter sandwich or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Okay. And she says, when you as a neurotypical person think of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, you think to yourself, okay, I need 2 pieces of bread, I need jelly, I need peanut butter. You can see it in your mind. And as an adult now who's made enough peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, I can do that too. But probably when I was a kid or with any other large, overwhelming thing as an adult who has ADHD, we cannot see in our mind the finished sandwich, or we also can't see the steps we took to put the jelly on the bread or to put the peanut butter on the other bread, and then to also take those 2 things and put them back either in the fridge or the cupboard or wherever you keep them, and then put them together. Like, we have to start doing it to figure it out, which is why, and then it takes that practice of doing it. Like, I will say my oldest son, he hated loading the dishwasher. Hated it. And he would explain to me, he's like, it's just gross. It's disgusting. I'm like, you have to tell yourself while you're doing it, this is just water and food. This is just water and food and soap. That's it. It's gross. I'm not saying it's not gross. But as you tell yourself that, you will start to get to where you have convinced yourself that that is all it is, because it is. And it will seem less disgusting and you will be able to move through it faster. These days, I can ask him to load the dishwasher and he does it in 10 minutes. When he started, took him 45 minutes to an hour, because I had to stand there and go, okay, do the next one. Okay, do the next one. Do the next one. And that's the one thing that, so many ADHD women come to me. They're like, well, I'm trying this. I'm like, if it's a self-help book that says, just create this and just create that, and it's not working for you, that's because it's not designed for the ADHD brain. Because the ADHD brain can't just take a principle or a practical tip and apply it. We can't. We have to know why we're supposed to be doing it. We have to recognize that if we are trying to do it, that it's not going to be perfect right away. That's one thing a lot of us women struggle with. If it's not going to be perfect, then there's no point in doing it at all, which is just not true. Not how anybody arrives. And then it's also a matter of the first time or the first few times you do it, it's going to suck. It's not going to be fun. It's going to be difficult. And as you convince your brain, okay, this isn't that bad. This isn't that bad. I can do this. Eventually you get to a point where your reward system starts to operate the way it's supposed to work. And you start to know, well, once I just get this done, I'll feel a lot better.
Yeah.
But you
That's
have
so interesting.
yeah, you have to really work at it. And it's like I said, I'm finally to a point now with the driving that I'm like, okay, it's not draining me so much. I do have to still keep my radio off most of the time. And I have to, as I'm doing the driving, I have to do that self-talk. I have to, and usually I say self-talk. It's usually more prayers because that is the thing I have found. As a Christian woman who speaks specifically about ADHD, there's so much out there right now about mindfulness and mindfulness practicing and meditation and yoga for ADHD and all these things. And as a Christian woman, I have convictions about all those. So that's kind of where I try to help women who are, who maybe they want to try. I want to try the idea of like the mindfulness meditation, but I also have reservations and convictions because of my faith. So it's really, that's where I really love what I'm now offering with the Christian Meditation Vault, because it's the opposite of what Eastern meditation teaches. Eastern meditation teaches to, just allow for your mind to go blank. Whereas instead with Christian meditation and things along those lines, we're actually more filling the mind with God's word. But the nice thing about it too is you don't have to sit down and, spend an hour trying to do it. You can start doing it the minute you're working on any sort of task that's difficult for you. That's when you start applying it, and you just start using whatever verse you can memorize fairly quickly and pray it over and over again. And in your mind, as you're doing it, you are surrendering the difficulty of whatever it is that you're having to deal with over to God and allowing him to do what he needs to do with it and to fill in that gap for you. But it is not easy.
And it's a conscious effort, which is, and it always will be, right? It's such useful and helpful information. So thank you so much for all of that. One last thing I would love for you to share, because you've been navigating with this diagnosis for a little while. What would your greatest piece of advice be to a woman who this is new? She either suspects or maybe she's newly diagnosed with ADHD. What would you say to her?
My biggest thing is you have to learn that practice is okay and that perfectionism does not exist. One thing that I have had to tell myself anytime that I have, the emotions of, other women can do it and I just can't. I have to tell myself that there are things that I can do that other women can't.
Yep.
And you have to constantly remind yourself of that, because if not, you can get stuck in that shame spiral, like I was talking about earlier, where if you are stuck in shame, you're just constantly putting all of this blame on yourself and you feel like you have no way to take action. As guilt, actually, yes, you're guilty of making a mistake. Maybe you're guilty of dropping the ball at work. You're guilty of, yelling at your spouse or saying something mean impulsively, because that's all part of ADHD. And instead of this shame feeling of, I'm just never going to get it right, you can instead allow yourself to feel guilty, because you're going to use that guilt to take action, and you're going to either apologize or you're going to set in motion some sort of practice that you need to be able to do it less. But it's not about doing it the perfect way right off the bat. It is about progress through practice.
Yes, absolutely. I love that, progress through practice. I love that.
Thanks.
So thank you.